Hello and welcome to this edition of CIBER Focus, your source for international business news. I'm Matt Locke, and with me today is Sandy Owens of the U.S. Commerce Department. He is a senior commercial officer with the Commerce Department. Thank you, Mr. Owens, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as I mentioned, you're a commercial officer with the Commerce Department, and you have a lot of experience working overseas in embassies. And when most people think of embassies, they're thinking of ambassadors and diplomats. So how does the commercial officer play into the embassies?
Well, commercial officer is on the ambassador's country team, and he reports and works alongside the State Department colleagues and with the ambassador. And so whatever the goals of the mission, we work toward those goals.
Okay. So what sort of opportunities are there with the commercial service?
There are domestic opportunities, and there's also foreign service opportunities. And we have over 80-something U.S. export assistance centers throughout the United States. And there's also a path to careers in the foreign commercial service, in the foreign service, through the Commerce Department.
Okay. So do most commercial officers come from a business background?
A lot of commercial officers have a business background, but a lot of also young commercial officers go through an assessment that we hold maybe every year or 2 years, and have had some experience in either the government or they can have had private sector experience. It just depends on where they are in their career. But I would say most of them are 3 or 4 years outside of their graduating degree or master's.
So what does a typical day look like for a commercial officer?
Well, that's the great news, that there's not a typical day. We work with and provide services for U.S. companies. So a typical day could be counseling companies that are visiting your post. It could be, of course, answering hundreds of emails. It could be working with a local USIAC. It could be attending an event in the country. It could be working or going to meetings at the ministry. It could be putting on holding a service with a U.S. company, maybe doing a promotion for that company, or in a typical case, you could have a trade mission that was visiting several countries several countries in the region, and you could be hosting a trade mission. So there's really not a typical day.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of skills that go into this job. So
there's a lot of skills,
yeah.
and by the time you probably become a senior officer, you will have hosted hundreds and hundreds of companies and trade missions from all parts of the United States. We recently had one led by the governor of Maryland come to Jordan in my last post.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Do commercial officers then, do they particularly have an area of expertise, or do you kind of have to be a jack of all trades to do all of that?
We are not specialists, and we leave that to our Foreign Service nationals who take different sectors and are mostly specialists, for example, in energy or in ICT or whatever it might be, but we're generalists. And that is the difference between a state officer who is either political, economic, management, or consular, and a commercial officer. We sort of are a jack of all trades.
So in what ways does the commercial service help U.S. companies?
Great question. We do counseling for them. So we work alongside our U.S. Export Assistance Centers, our domestic offices all throughout the states. And we will talk to them either on a conference call or have them, if they're in the country, we'll bring them in. And our Foreign Service nationals, who are the specialists, will sit down and we'll have a meeting, whatever sector it might be. So we can do that. The other thing is the market research and intelligence that they need for that market. A lot of that will come domestically, but they work with the Post, and so we'll try to enhance their visit by briefing them beforehand. Here are the things we need to focus on, here's what we can do for you. And one of the best services that we have is called a Gold Key service, which is really a matchmaking service. So if the company comes in and we have notice, we can set up a series of one-on-one meetings for that company, and we will accompany them to those interviews, and we'll be there to help facilitate language issues and just support them as they sort of go through the process. And at the end of that 1 day or 2 days or however many days it might be, we can help them analyze some of the results. And of course, all of this involves working with the team at our embassy, and we might bring in other factors and other team players from the embassy to also support the companies from our economic section or our public affairs section if we're doing a promotional event. We'll bring in the press and people like that. So it's really a team effort, but we can absolutely help that company make a match, and that's sort of the key, and I would say one of the mainstays of what we do for U.S. companies in interest.
So you started your career with the Georgia Power Company in Atlanta.
A long time ago, I did. Yeah.
And you're now studying German for your upcoming post in Vienna. What led your career path from Atlanta to Vienna?
Well, I worked for 2 years at the Georgia Power Company, and then I ended up working in the government, actually at the Department of Commerce for about 3 or 4 years. And through working there, one day there was an opportunity to go out and open an office in San Diego. At that time, California, one of the 5th largest economies in the world, only had 2 U.S. Export Assistance Centers, 2 domestic offices. So the third one in California was going to be in San Diego. So I had an opportunity to go help establish that office. So once I became a commercial trade specialist, I ended up working in San Francisco and Seattle, and then I ended up taking a position overseas in Singapore for a limited time. And during that time, I took the Foreign Service exam, and which for commerce is an assessment, and went into the foreign side, the Foreign Service part of the Commerce Department through a two-day assessment.
Okay, so at this point in your career, you've really worked all over the world. You mentioned Singapore and Jordan in your upcoming post in Vienna. So where else in the world have you worked in? How similar have these different countries been to work in?
They're all completely different, and to compare one to the other, I went from Singapore, where there is very little, it's all very transparent, and very interesting place for trade, and probably one of the best places to be a commercial officer, to the Dominican Republic, which is not as transparent and a little more different, and also a developing market. So it's a great market, but completely different economic environments as well. So one is developing and one is developed. And I found that true. I've worked in Slovakia in Central Europe, and that's more developing. So I'll be in Austria, which is just next door, but completely different economies, and their needs are completely different. So we have to be a little diverse and work around what we have, work around the market we're in. Jordan, of course, was very interesting because, one, it was in the Middle East and with everything going on with the Arab Spring, but it also needs everything. It needed energy is probably the biggest need, so that might not be the case in my new post in Vienna.
Okay, so you mentioned your recent post in Jordan, and now you're going to Vienna. And you've touched on this a little bit already, but how do you prepare for a move from one country to another?
Well, in this case, I'm taking German, so that's probably the biggest one thing that I'll be doing is I'll have the language in Austria, which I did not have in Jordan, and it's a different market, and so the needs are different, and so the companies that come through will probably already be established in the Austrian market, whereas that probably wasn't the case in Jordan. And I think a lot of times what that means is we'll be expanding the market for these companies versus trying to enter the market for developing markets. But you're working with everybody. And we're also now working, we just had a huge investment conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. So we're now promoting, of course, foreign investment into the United States, and that's probably not the case for Jordan, but it would be for Austria.
So what role do commercial officers play in U.S. diplomatic strategy?
We are, once again, on the team of the embassy, and we have been working very closely with our economic colleagues from the State Department in economic statecraft. And so that is I would say for the last 2.5 years, we have been promoting as an embassy the market for whatever post we're at. And we can do that in a lot of ways. And one of the more interesting things is that we have our ambassador involved with the promotion of U.S. exports and U.S. interest. So we go from the ambassador all the way down to our briefings with, sometimes it might be with the military, sometimes it might be with the economic office, sometimes it might be just strictly commercial. But we bring other aspects of the embassy together to help support diplomacy in that country. And let me just mention real quickly the website for commerce, which is export.gov. So if you're interested in exporting or looking into exporting and you want to find out who to contact, you just go to export.gov.
So you mentioned a couple of different ways that these two countries are different commercially, but are there any other differences between these two countries and commercial opportunities?
I don't know yet the Austrian market. I haven't. I've visited several times, but I don't really know the details yet for the Austrian market. But I can tell you that from what I know, the groups that come to Austria will probably have been in Europe, and so they'll be touring. You know, they'll be established franchisees or whatever you want to say. Whereas in Jordan, you might get a lot more smaller to medium-sized companies. Yeah, not to say that one's better than the other, but Austria is a developed market, you know, developed country, whereas the Middle East is still growing.
Okay, so before we go, what advice do you have for any young professionals or students that might be interested in a career in commercial service?
Well, I would say, of course, your background is essential, and if you're interested in working for either the commercial in the commercial service or in the State Department, you could go on a website called careers.state.gov for the State Department, and also at the commercial service there is an office for Office of Foreign Service, Human Capital, or whatever, OFSHR. You can get in touch with them to find out when I don't have the website, but when they have the assessment. So I would say the state's Foreign Service exam is given maybe twice or 3 times a year, whereas an assessment, I think I mentioned this, is only given once every year or once every 2 years. So I would say an international background and international affairs or development, foreign affairs, and getting a language, you know, because at some point you're going to need a language for whatever market. And out of your first 5 years, you'll spend at least 3 of those years in an overseas post.
All right, well, is there anything else that I didn't ask you about that you'd like to share with our audience?
No, it's been I've enjoyed the career. This will probably be one of my last posts, and it's fascinating. And the people I've met have been fantastic, and it's just been a rewarding experience for me, and I've just been very happy. The one thing I would say is what you would really need to make your career successful is a supportive family. So it's sort of a family decision. If you have children and a spouse or a partner, you need to have a talk and make sure that they're all on board, because there's a lot of long nights away, and it's just you're in a foreign place, and so you just need to have that discussion before you decide to move overseas or pursue a career in the Foreign Service.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mr. Owens, for speaking with us today.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, you can email cibeer@indiana.edu.